Hi, and welcome to Nevaeh's Nightmare, and on this channel we talk about all things spooky, true crime, and everything kind of related. And since it is the month of October, we're going to be diving down a bit of the vampire route. In the 1960s, it was the golden age of horror films in Great Britain, and one film studio had a monopoly in the world of British horror. This was Hammer Studios, and starting in 1958 with their vision of Dracula, they produced a stream of horror films that would feature some of the classic characters such as Dracula, Frankenstein, and a purely British context. By the late 1960s, these horror films had seeped into the wider popular culture so much that real life began to mirror fiction. In 1969, these two worlds collided smack dab in the center of London and gave birth to the strange happenings known as the Highgate Vampire. Before we get into the Highgate Vampire, we should talk a little bit about the Highgate Cemetery. Highgate Cemetery was established in London in 1838 to provide more burial space for the dead. The cemetery is the burial place for many writers, philosophers, poets, and politicians, and is very well known for its ornate sculptures and gravestones. By the 1960s, the cemetery had fallen into disrepair and was being vandalized repeatedly. The cemetery became a popular hangout spot for many of the bored teenagers in the local area. Rumors circulated that it was haunted, and it had become a place where Satanists would hang out. The 1960s were a time when interest in the occult was at an all-time high. The UK was no exception to this, and many young people in the country began to take interest in it. The wider culture looked at many of these young people as Satanists gathering in graveyards in the middle of the night, sacrificing animals to the devil. Hysteria grew, and many people became scared of places just like the Highgate Cemetery. And in the 1960s, people started to see some strange things there. In 1965, a man was walking his dog through the Highgate Cemetery. Passing through the west gate, he suddenly felt a chill roll through his body and an unnatural stillness. He then saw an oozing black liquid come down from the cemetery wall that formed into the shape of a man with glowing red eyes. He then turned and ran. 2 years later, a young couple witnessed a grotesque face staring back at them from the same gate. Events such as these became frequent at the Highgate Cemetery, and they came to the attention of one Bishop Sean Manchester. Manchester was a member of the Catholic sect that was outside of the mainstream Catholic Church. He was convinced that the Highgate Cemetery was inhabited by the spirits of true evil, and he resolved to fight them. He began to investigate the strange ongoings in 1968. Manchester went to Highgate and noticed that there was a path that led up to one of the larger mausoleums and felt that what was haunting the cemetery was coming from there. While Manchester was busy investigating the evil that lurked at Highgate, other occurrences kept happening there. People reported that they saw a tall figure approaching them at the cemetery that filled them with fright. This happened over and over again, and the entity was given the name the Highgate Vampire. In 1967, two teenage girls were walking through the cemetery and claimed to have seen the dead rising from their grave. In the summer of 1969, one of the girls, who we'll call Elizabeth, contacted Sean Manchester. Elizabeth claimed that she was being visited in her room at night by the entity with a cadaverous appearance. Manchester met Elizabeth and her boyfriend Keith, and he noticed that she had two small puncture wounds on her neck similar to those left by a vampire. Manchester claimed that he hung a crucifix and garlic in her room and sprayed holy water everywhere. After this, Elizabeth began to recover, and her experience helped convince the bishop that he was dealing with a vampire that lurked in the depths of the Highgate Cemetery. Meanwhile, strange entities kept being seen at Highgate. Figures were seen all across the cemetery, and more disturbing events took place. Foxes were found mutilated all over the ground, and people in the area were concerned that Satanists were catching the poor animals and sacrificing them. This increased the level of tension in the area, and people began to demand answers. At the same time, the media got involved and started to hype up the events at the cemetery. Enter into the story paranormal investigator David Farrant. Farrant was the founder of a small group called the British Psychic and Occult Society. Ferrant went to investigate Highgate Cemetery for himself, and he saw a gray figure there that he interpreted as a ghost encounter. Ferrant felt that what people were seeing was not a physical entity and not actually a physical vampire, as Sean Manchester believed. Ferrant believed that he could expel the spirit from the cemetery and began to take steps to do so. This was caused a rivalry between him and Manchester that would last forever. Events continued to escalate in Highgate Cemetery, and now both Ferrant and Manchester were on the scene. One night, a man saw a trail of blood leading from one of the mausoleums, and he also saw a shadowy figure disappear into one of the vaults. Manchester also encountered yet another girl named Louisa who claimed to be visited by a strange being at night that left puncture wounds on her neck. Louisa was also sleepwalking, and Manchester claimed that he and her sister followed her into the cemetery on one of her sleepwalks. Louisa was wearing a crucifix necklace, and when it was violently ripped off, Manchester heard a loud boom that echoed across the cemetery. Manchester stated that he had to carry Louisa home and that she had no knowledge of the incident. Ferrant continued his investigation of the strange ongoings at the cemetery, and he became further convinced that what people were seeing was a disincarnate specter and not, as Manchester claimed, a flesh and blood vampire. The media became more and more interested in the case, and they especially became interested by the weirdness and rivalry between Manchester and Ferrant. The actual sightings that people had began to see had gotten lost as the two men sniped at each other consistently in the media. Things had came to a head on the evening of Friday, March 13th, 1970. Yes, I said Friday the 13th. Manchester had started stating that he was going to perform a mass exorcism in the cemetery on that evening and earlier in the day, and he and Ferrant went on the TV station ITV and gave an interview about what had been happening at Highgate. This caused a mass panic in London, and swarms of people descended to the cemetery looking for the vampire. At one point, the crowd got completely out of control and started tearing down the gates and vandalizing the gravestones. The police were actually called out to restore order and told everyone to leave. Quid pro quo, don't vandalize people's gravestones. Anyways, after this, people would go to the cemetery at night and continue their search for the vampire. In August 1970, the body of a woman was found in the cemetery with her head cut off. She had only been removed from a grave, and this was considered by the police to be the work of cultists. Ferrant, who was still investigating, was actually arrested and accused of the crime by the police, but they had no evidence to hold him. Ferrant was probably innocent of the crime anyway, and as one of the most visible investigators, he was on the police's radar. Another incident at the time involved a man who lived close to the cemetery. He went to his car to go somewhere and found a dead body sitting in it with no head. Eventually, things did calm down at Highgate Cemetery, and Bishop Manchester claimed that in 1973 he finally managed to track down the vampire and drove a stake through its heart. He made certain that Nosferatu would never rise again by leaving garlic in the vault, and for a little while later, the press were still focused on Manchester and Ferrant. They had a field day when Manchester challenged Ferrant to a wizard battle in a public park. This was eventually canceled when Ferrant didn't show up, and the local RSPCA were somehow concerned that cats were going to be sacrificed there. After this, the media moved on to other stories and forgot all about Bishop Sean Manchester, David Ferrant, and the Highgate Vampire. So what happened in the Highgate Cemetery between 1966 and 1970? What were people actually seeing there? Remember when I told you about the Hammer horror films and the 1960s occult revival? It seems what had happened were people in London were watching a lot of the type of gothic horror that Hammer Studios was best known for. At the same time, the 1960s occult revival was taking place, and young people would congregate in places like Highgate. We could say this allowed for people's imaginations to run wild, and they mistook ordinary occurrences for supernatural activity. There may have also been an actual paranormal event that people witnessed, and a mass hysteria set in that was stoked by the media coverage. This could have caused a tulpa. A tulpa, or a thought form, is an entity that is created by people's desires, hopes, and fears. It can take the form that people often subconsciously want it to take. In this case, it took on the form of what people, influenced by horror movies, wanted it to take: a vampire. Unfortunately, what people had actually saw and experienced at Highgate Cemetery was overshadowed by the rivalry between David Farrett and Sean Manchester. The two men became the focus of media coverage, and the whole affair really just became a freak show. Powered by an overly sensationalistic media, everything just got out of hand and even resulted in criminal activity. Farrett and Manchester wouldn't help anybody by taking the Highgate Vampire seriously, as they continued sniping at each other on TV shows and podcasts until Farrett passed away in 2019. There is an interesting conclusion to this story. In 1972, Hammer Studios made a movie based on their Highgate Vampire case called Dracula 1972. Here was a case of fiction inspiring real life, and real life inspiring fiction again. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what you think about this case. Was there actually a vampire? Was there entities? Or was it just two men, two wizards fighting? Also, make sure to check out the Strange Realities Conference at www.strangerealitiesconference.com. There's going to be a lot of cool people there. It's the weekend after Halloween, and I'm very excited to see you guys. Looking for something to do after Halloween is over? Are you into the strange, bizarre, and unusual? On November 3rd, 4th, and 5th, the Strange Realities Conference is coming back to Nashville, Tennessee, and streaming online. Come join us for 3 days exploring mysteries, supernatural, the occult, weird history, and more, featuring lectures, presentations, and workshops by Tim Banal, Zach Hunt, Cheslin Vance, Bryn Collier, Tobias Whalen, Brent Rains, Joshua Cutchin, Kiki Dombrowski, Recluse, Nathan Isaac, Christopher Ernst, Aaron Gulius, David Metcalf, Timothy Renner, Mallory Sawinski, Soraya Ascap, and special guest Steve Berg as your Master of Ceremonies. Make sure to join us for the fun and informative weekend online and at SIR Nashville November 3rd and 4th, and online only November 5th. Tickets are available at strangerealitiesconference.com.